Thank you for joining us for this important discussion about California's public lands. My name is Cecilia Estolano, and I am CEO of the Better World Group. We've been around for 20 years and been a part of some of the most ambitious climate and environmental achievements that this state has accomplished. We are very honored to host a dynamic panel of environmental experts who've been working on issues of conservation and public lands, not just in California, but across the country. I want to start by acknowledging that where I sit in beautiful Altadena, California, is the ancestral homeland of the Cajamarca people of the Tonga tribe. And Indigenous voices are critical to the conversation that we have today. Sadly, we do not have anybody from Indigenous community here on this call today, but we are honoring the role that Indigenous folks and tribal voices play in the management of our lands. So we look forward to talking about these collective public lands and honoring the ancestors. I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover this morning. First, we're going to have a wonderful conversation with our Attorney General, our great Attorney General, Javier Becerra, who's going to talk a little bit about what he's been doing to help preserve California and our public lands against the onslaught coming from the federal administration in Washington. We're going to cover a bunch of different topics. We're going to have a conversation for about 10 minutes with the Attorney General, and then we're going to toss it over to Sammy Roth from Los Angeles Times, who's going to be a moderator for a conversation with a number of panelists. So let's get right into it with the Attorney General. I want to thank you, sir, for joining us today. You have been a fighter for us here in California for quite some time. We've long been recognized as a leader here in the state of California. We have beautiful resources. But 45% of our open space is actually controlled by the federal government. So I want to ask you, you've been suing, I think you've filed 100 cases against the Trump administration on a number of different matters, many of them related to the environment. I want to ask you, from where you sit, what are some of the most important issues you've been fighting on the issue of public lands? Maybe just a couple of examples, because you've filed so many cases here in California.
Cecilia, first, thanks for having me. And you're right. What we do is so critical to what we consider, or what we call, California. We're a state that is so rich in resources, not just in terms of natural resources, but our people, the diversity, everything that gives California this opportunity to be this golden gem at the same time that's the economic engine for the country. And so the Department of Justice in California takes its role very seriously in protecting our people, our resources, and our values. And so every time we see any of those three put in harm's way, we act, not because it's easy or because it's fun, it's because we must. And so it should surprise no one that of the 100, I think we're up to about 102 lawsuits against Donald Trump, half of them are in the environmental space, because this administration has made it very clear they intend to backslide on everything we've done to progress, to protect our environment. And what we have simply done is said, no, you have to follow the law. No one is above the law. And while our laws haven't gone far enough in protecting the environment and our public health, we can't let them roll back. And so we've taken action. Recently, we took an action where we have taken the Trump administration to court because they're trying to open up thousands of acres of California land to fracking. And they're trying to go against the rules, the minimal rules that the federal government has on fracking itself. And Cecilia, as you and I know, more often than not, it's not just bad for the environment, but it's bad for disadvantaged communities that live in and around where most of that fracking will take place. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why at the California Department of Justice, we established the Bureau of Environmental Justice, because it's not just a matter of trying to protect our environment. We know that the people that are first and worst hit by environmental degradation are the poorest and least capable of defending themselves. And so our Environmental Justice Bureau is out there making sure we're hunting for the cases where people's rights are being violated, but they don't have the wherewithal to protect themselves. And so we're continuing to act. We've taken action to try to stop things that go on beyond our California borders, whether it's in the Arctic Circle, trying to make sure that we're protecting those pristine lands that still exist up in Alaska and other parts of the world, or whether it's simply teaming with some of our AG colleagues throughout the country to make sure that we stand up for the things that we have established, whether it's the Clean Car Standards, the Clean Power Plan, or whether it's the way we regulate the release of methane gas. All of that coming together is to say one thing: we don't own this place, as the Native American proverbs say. We're just renting it from our future generations, and so we need to leave this place as good, if not better, than what we found it. And I'll simply tell you this: this is 2020, not 1920. And in two ways, that it's a great statement, because it's not 1920. 1920, we still had many more natural resources around. We still had a whole bunch of species that were still around. 2020, we don't. This is not 1920. At the same time, politically, this is 2020. It is not 1920. We're not going back to those political days of 1920. We're going to do things differently. So that's why California Department of Justice takes those roles seriously, and we will continue to lead.
I appreciate that, Mr. Attorney General. And I also appreciate what you've done on filing lawsuits to try to stop the Trump administration from opening about 1 million acres in the Central Valley and the Central Coast to fracking and mining. I want to touch on something you noted about the connection between public lands conservation and environmental justice, and that link between so many disadvantaged communities really not having access to clean air, clean water, even sometimes access to open space. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that connection between the importance of preserving public lands in their pristine nature and trying to maintain some semblance of environmental justice and climate protection?
Yeah, and Cecilia, sometimes people don't connect the dots well, but
Right.
I now realize that my parents were some of the best environmentalist conservationists we've ever seen. Except they never knew it. They just called it being frugal because they didn't have a lot of money. So we didn't have a lot of time to leave the lights on at night in all the rooms because we couldn't afford the utility bills. We could go out to have all these meals where it's disposable paper and plastic products because we made everything at home. We made it with fruits and vegetables. And in so many ways, we conserved without realizing what we were doing. At the same time, what we realized is that my family couldn't take me to Disneyland, but we could go to a state park.
Right.
We could take advantage of the beauty that was out there for all of us. And so in so many different ways, when we preserve our public lands, we're doing not just a good service to Mother Nature, but to people who have to learn to appreciate what they have. And that's where I think we often forget that it is people who don't have a great deal of money, a lot of financial resources, who are some of the best protectors of our public lands and who are also the most in need of having access to those public lands. And so for me, just being out there to protect public lands takes me back to my own childhood. At the same time, it takes me forward to my grandkids' childhood and making sure that they still have that too.
That's great. Thank you so much. I have one closing question for you, Mr. Attorney General. So what can we do? I mean, what more can we do as Californians, as the state of California, to try to steer things in a better direction when the federal government is really kind of coming at us?
Three things. It's 2020, not 1920. Always keep that in mind. As I remember hearing one time in a conversation, I was told, never do mild. If you're going to do something, if you're going to jump into that pool, jump into the deep end of that pool. Never do mild. And so if you believe in protecting our public resources, our public lands, never do mild. Go all the way. Finally, let's remember that you don't have to be the richest person in the world to make a difference. There is one great thing about America. It does let you punch way above your assigned weight class. You may walk into the ring not having a whole lot of money, not having a whole lot of experience. But if you have what I call in Spanish, ganas, the sheer desire and determination, you can punch way above that assigned weight class. And so not 1920 is 2020. Never do mild, and know that you'll get to punch above your weight class to defend not just our natural resources and Mother Nature, but what it means for our families moving forward to have them.
Thank you so much for your time, for spending a bit of time with us this morning. It is 2020. There is something called an election out there. And I know that you've been working very hard to make sure that we actually have the ability to vote and to not be intimidated as we go to the polls. So, Mr. Attorney General Javier, it's nice to see you again. I hope you and your family are safe. And we look forward to talking to you again soon on conservation issues. Thank you so much.
Cecilia, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I want to pivot over to our panel discussion with Sammy Roth. Um, the Attorney General kind of set a little bit of a tone, talked a little bit about the threats. Let me just introduce our moderator, Sammy Roth, of the Los Angeles Times, who's going to introduce the rest of our panelists and lead the conversation. Sammy covers energy for the Los Angeles Times, and he also publishes a newsletter called The Boiling Point, which frankly is like a must read for any environmental nerd or somebody who just likes to read vibrant writing about, kind of the future of the planet. So I'm delighted to have Sammy here today. I'm sure he's going to ask us some tough questions. So I want to turn it over to him to moderate the rest of our discussion. Thank you, Sammy.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Cecilia, and for inviting me to be a part of this panel today. And thank you also for shouting out Boiling Point. If anyone listening wants to sign up for that, it's really easy. Go to latimes.com/boilingpoint. You can sign up for free and get that every Thursday. We have a really good panel here today. I'll just quickly introduce our panelists before we begin the discussion. You've all already met Cecilia here, the CEO of Better World Group. We've got Hans Kohl, who's the Director of Environmental Campaigns and Advocacy at Patagonia, the outdoor retailer. We have Graciela Cabello, who is the Director of Youth and Community Engagement at Los Padres Forest Watch, which exists to protect the Los Padres National Forest and Carrizo Plain National Monument. And we also have Sean Hecht, who is the Co-Executive Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA, and he is also a professor at UCLA Law School. So thank you, everyone, for being part of this panel. I should also shout out before I ask my first question, if you have in the audience, if you're listening to this and you have something you want to ask, please put it into the chat. In the last 15 minutes of the hour, we'll be pulling questions out of there from you to pose to our panelists. So I think I want to jump right in with some news this week with a question for Sean. I think the big news in the public land sphere over the last week has been that a federal judge in Montana has ruled that William Perry Pendley, the acting director of the Federal Bureau of Land Management, has been in that position as acting director illegally for more than 400 days. And the judge said that any actions that he took in that capacity should be undone because he was in the role illegally. Sean, I guess I'm really curious, one, how you think this is going to play out with the Bureau of Land Management and these actions undertaken by Perry Pendley, and specifically, are there actions here affecting California that this agency has undertaken that you think could be affected or potentially undone?
Thank you, and I wanted to also thank Cecilia and Better World Group for putting this all together. So yes, it was quite a ruling from the judge in Montana. Mr. Pendley has been acting director of BLM for over a period of time where the president really had an obligation to confirm an actual director in the correct way, and it's unclear what the legal implications of this are going to be. I mean, in practical terms, I think it's unlikely that the courts are going to undo an entire administration's worth of decision-making, but it definitely calls it into question. And the Bureau of Land Management controls a lot of land here in California. So for example, there are large areas of public land on the central coast of California and in the Central Valley of California and out in the desert. And in the Central Valley and on the coast, a lot of that land has been opened up to fracking during this administration. And there have been legal challenges both by Attorney General Becerra and also by various other groups to those decisions. The Bureau of Land Management isn't as well known as the Forest Service or the Park Service, but it controls most of our federal public lands. And there's a lot of extractive industries that operate mining, logging, and oil drilling on those lands. I can't predict how this is going to play out. I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see the mass undoing of every federal action in that agency. But I do think that a lot of the decisions on the substance of those decisions are wrong as well and have been challenged in court. And so it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I mean, Pendley is very well known as being basically an anti-public lands activist before he became the head of the Bureau of Land Management. So there's quite an irony in having him in that position, and it shows the destructive nature of this administration.
So there are a couple of those specific actions that you alluded to that I want to ask some of our other panelists about. Before I do that, talking about the various federal agencies, the BLM, the Forest Service, and others. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the federal government overall has what, close to 50% of the acreage in California, or it's a pretty significant number, right?
Yes, it's in the 40s, I believe. I don't have the precise number, but it's verging on half of the entire state's land.
Yeah, I mean, what I just think is so interesting about that is with environmental policy, a lot of times you think, well, California can protect itself and pass its own policies, but it seems like with, a lot of these federal lands issues that's really not the case, right?
Well, it is true that the land is controlled by the federal government, but it's also true, and it's been affirmed by courts over and over, that the state has the right to impose reasonable environmental regulations, even on federal activities on federal lands. And the question of how far those environmental protections can go is still an open question in any particular context. The state can't tell the federal government you can't drill for oil at all on federal lands, but it can impose real restrictions, and we've seen that in the past, and sometimes they can be really effective. So the state has some tools.
So on the issue of oil drilling, particularly, I want to bring Graciela into the conversation here. One of the big actions that the Bureau of Land Management has undertaken, which I think we were alluding to there, is this resource management plan in the Central Valley area. Where I think you said over 1 million acres, or at least part of it is in this plan, where the Trump administration is proposing to open it to oil and gas drilling. You have the first lease sale that I think has been held in California in about 8 years on federal land, in the Central Valley and the Bakersfield area. Graciela, I know that Los Padres Forest Watch has been really active on this issue. Could you talk a little bit about why this federal oil and gas plan is sort of a concern for your group, and how this might affect the national forest and the Carrizo Monument that you work to protect?
Sure. Well, first, I also want to thank Better World Group for hosting this panel, and also acknowledge that we are on True Match land, and they are the original protectors of the land. So thank you, everyone, for having us. And then to dive into Sammy's question, I would say that it's a public lands issue, a conservation issue, an environmental issue, all in one. It's the administration released the plan in 2018, and basically, the sites that are being open for leasing are in communities. They're next to schools. They're next to national monuments, national parks like Sequoia National Park, adjacent to the Carrizo Plain National Monument, and in Kern County, as we've heard. So that is a concern, because it affects recreation, it affects health, and it also affects our natural resources. We've been working on that plan with a coalition of other groups to really oppose the plan since the beginning. And we've garnered over 90,000 comments in opposition. And in spite of that, the Trump administration has moved forward in approving the plan. They approved this under a very limited environmental review, which basically was deficient in its legality. And so the concern now is that they're moving forward without adequately assessing the environmental impacts to the land and the surrounding communities. And so currently there is litigation among several groups, including the state of California, as Attorney General mentioned, and us with a couple other groups. So I'm not sure if that necessarily answers your question.
No, I think it does. I am curious, what how has the fight against this plan been going? I mean, do you where is it legally, and do you see a victory on the horizon here? Or is this something where if Trump were reelected, for instance, given enough time, they're going to get around it one way or another?
Well, I would say that it depends on the election, of course. And then, as Sean mentioned, the direction of BLM, there has been a lot of deregulation that has happened, especially in regards to NEPA, which is one of the bedrock environmental laws, and that really prevents the community and the public in engaging in such projects. So there's a lot at stake in terms of what's going to happen litigation is currently pending in court, but that doesn't mean that they're not allowed to move forward with the projects. So as we're seeing in Kern County, they're moving forward with the initial 4,000 acres that are both in Bakersfield, and they're adjacent to the Carrizo Plain National Monument, as well as Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge. So, you know, it's going to really affect not only public land, wildlife, and certain species, but also public health.
So I want to bring Cecilia and Hans into the conversation shortly, but before I do, Graciela, one more question for you. I think it's interesting, your title at Los Padres Forest Watch is Director of Youth and Community Engagement. I guess I'm curious what you've seen in terms of, I guess particularly with youth engagement I'm interested in, but just, you know, in the communities that you serve, what kind of response you've seen to the policies being pursued by the Trump administration, and sort of, you know, how the last 4 years may have changed or impacted people's engagement with their public lands and with public lands protection issues.
Yeah, I would say that the youth are really leading on a lot of the environmental justice fronts, and they're really bringing to the table a narrative around intersectional environmentalism and intersectional conservation. And what that means is really taking a look at the variety of issues that affect their life, especially in BIPOC communities. If you're not familiar with that term, it means Black, Indigenous, people of color. Who are really bringing to the table, you know, how it affects their education, how race issues play a part in access and environmental justice issues, and a ton of other things. So I would say that youth are, you know, definitely on the forefront of fight on environmental justice and conservation.
So I think this is a good opportunity for a question I wanted to ask Cecilia to continue the conversation here with diverse communities and engagement with public lands. You know, you spoke with the Attorney General a few minutes ago. He was sort of making the point that you know, low-income communities and people of color are some of sort of the, you know, the best defenders and users of public lands. I guess I'm interested, and this maybe strays a little bit from our topic of the election, but I'm sure you'll bring it around to that if you'd like. You know, I'm interested in the issue of equitable access to public lands and environmental justice on public lands. I guess I'm hoping you can speak a little bit to, how as a state and how, in the federal policy sphere, what are the things we can be doing to make sure that everyone, actually has access to public lands and to outdoor space. And I think that's a question both of our traditional public lands and also this issue of urban nature and the lack of green space in communities. So I'm hoping you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, one thing I want to talk about is a bill that didn't make it this term, but is important, because even though we're talking about federal public lands policy, we also have to lead in California. It's not like us to just sit back and say, oh, we're a victim, there's nothing we can do. So we still have to act and we still have to lead. And I want to talk a little bit about AB 3030, because it talks about the need to really preserve some of our resources. We need to preserve 30% of California's land areas. And it would kind of set a goal that we do that by 2030, right? And the reason it's important to just put a stake in the ground in that is because of this erosion of an encroachment on so many of our wild lands. And when that happens, we see things like these massive conflagrations. And I'm sitting here in Altadena and dealing with the bobcats fire smoke still, right? We see incursions in the wildlands. That wildland urban interface is critical. And we need to make sure that we actually save and set aside this land for the future, for future generations, so they can access it. And then we also need to think about what role we play in advocating so that the federal government doesn't have incursions into that land. I want to talk to you about that access piece too, right? We're sitting here in Southern California. People don't really think about it as having a lot of public lands and open space. They really think about Yosemite or Sequoia and stuff like that. But let me tell you, I'm sitting here at San Gabriel Valley, right? The San Gabriel Mountains, the Angeles National Forest are important. In the pandemic, if we haven't seen anything, it's that we understand that the need to have open space, public lands is critical for our physical and our mental health. And so we have to have access to this. Some of the groups in our area, like Active SGV here on the San Gabriel Valley, is working to create linkages through Metro to have linkages, just basically shuttles running from the Gold Line. There were so many people within a short distance walk from the Gold Line that if they could get to the end of the Gold Line and then take a shuttle up to some of these amazing spaces in the San Gabriel Mountains, we've now created an opening for everyone to share in open space. But this is ours, it's our patrimony. We have to understand that this is an election issue, because we could create access to this, but if we don't have good management, if we don't have protection of these lands, if we allow things to be open for fracking, for mining, I mean, I didn't even talk about open pits, cyanide leach pits for gold in Inyo. I mean, ridiculous things that you think would happen in strange places, right, are about to happen in California, because we're all so distracted by all these other issues. We can't pay attention to every single assault on our open lands, on our public lands. So Sammy, I think this is a critical election year issue, and it's important to everyone, not just the folks who live near those spaces, but to everyone who, this is our patrimony. This is our birthright as Californians and Americans. This is our birthright, and we have to protect it. The best way to protect it is to vote. As soon as you get that ballot, vote. It matters what we do and the message we send to the federal government.
So one point to follow up on that, I am glad you brought up AB 3030, the protect 30% of California's lands and waters by 2030 bill. I think that's a really fascinating concept. It's something that's, of course, taken off not just in California, but there's a national movement around this. There's a global movement around it. I guess I'm interested in one, knowing that just land is so hard fought over in California. We've got all the federal land, we've got private land, we've got counties that want to defend how they want to use their land. We've got all these proposals still for developments out in the desert and continued development in the wildland urban interface. So I guess I'm curious, one, how you see that that kind of initiative being implemented, and how what it might look like for us to actually go about accomplishing that. And two, just politically, how how to even get something like that across the finish line when it could be so fraught. I mean, that bill had a lot of hype around it in the legislature this year, but ultimately didn't go anywhere.
Look, this is the long game, right? It often takes a few times to take a big concept like that. Look at what we did with our Climate Solutions Act. It took years to get that done, and we were a part of that at Better World Group. So you put a marker down, and it may take you a while, but you build a constituency. The nice thing about 3030 is, like, we're going to do 30% of the land, 30% of our public open space by 2030. That's something that people can understand, and we're close to that in California. And then we want to project that nationally. People understand that if we can set aside this land, it is like the lungs of our community, right? It's the relief valve. It's a chance for our biodiversity to recover. So how do we build that constituency? By just talking about it, by having conversations like this today, by connecting with all kinds of different communities. We started this conversation by talking about communities of color and like diverse communities and the way they value public lands. The Attorney General was absolutely right? Some of the strongest voting patterns for environmental issues are actually communities of color, Latinos and Black folks and Asians, vote in droves to protect the environment. So this is the next generation. Their numbers of support for issues like conservation and trying to deal with climate change are through the roof. So this is something that its time is coming, and I think we need to talk about it more. Again, there's been a lot of noise about a lot of things, so this is probably not high on anybody's radar screen, but it's a simple concept that everybody can really understand. 30% is not a whole lot when you think about it. When you think about the values we get from that, our health, our well-being, and the saving of our planet, the species that we're protecting, this is something I think we can relate to as Californians. And I know you want to get to Hans, so I'm going to stop talking.
No, it's okay. I do want to get to Hans. And actually, talking about building coalitions, in support of these types of policies, I think that's an interesting place to bring Hans in. Actually, I was writing about this recently. The outdoor recreation industry as a whole has, become, it has always been somewhat politically engaged, perhaps relative to other industries, but has really gotten fired up over public lands issues the last few years, going back to some of the national monument revocations by the Trump administration. And I mean, of course, Patagonia has always been, somewhat political and has been active in this space. I mean, Hans, you guys, as I understand it, for the first time in 2018, endorsed 2 Senate candidates. This year, you've got recommendations, I believe, in something like 24 Senate races across the country. And So I guess I guess I'm really interested in, why Patagonia as a company has taken up activism politically in this way, and just sort of what you're hoping to get out of it. I mean, what sorts of policies at a federal level and in California you actually want to enact through this type of work.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy. I appreciate it, and thanks for setting up this panel to the group and to Cecilia. And I'd like to also follow up and acknowledge that Patagonia's headquarters, like Graciela, is also on ancestral Chumash land. We live and work on those lands and honor their stewardship over the millennia. And yeah, we're fired up. I think that's what I'd say. We're a company that was founded by people who love the outdoors, who are climbers and surfers and, folks who get out there and spend every weekend with their families in public spaces, public lands. And that sort of feeling of, if you get out there and if you enjoy these places, you also have a responsibility to help protect them and take care of them. And it's also impossible to be out there in those spaces as our customers and employees are without seeing the threats and without hearing from local people how dire those threats are for human communities, for wildlife, for everyone, for the planet, and for climate. So we're in it for our people. We're in it because we love these places and love the outdoors. And for us, I think first off, it's about supporting that grassroots level. I really have to give another shout out to Graciela and Los Padres Forest Watch, to what our industry needs to do, really lean in on. And this goes over into sort of the issues of how these, impacts the environment cross over with human communities, is support groups at the grassroots level, local groups, people who understand the issues and understand the intersection between what's happening to our public lands and what's happening to human, people who live right there and deal with it every day. We also really believe strongly that, in addition to sort of the health benefit, in addition to these just being great for our communities, protected public lands equal jobs. This is an economic force. Our protected system of public lands out there, it absolutely is the infrastructure that supports our industry. We couldn't make things and sell them and have people use them out there as we do if there weren't these incredible places for folks to use the products, to get out there and experience it and be a part of it. And so, the economic engine that is driven by protected places and a protected environment is incredible. It's, $92 billion in consumer spending in California alone, hundreds of thousands of jobs. And this is part of what can pull us out of the economic crisis we're in now, is leaning in on these values and protecting places that bring these economic opportunities. So we're in it for all those reasons, and we're in it for, frankly, the future of our planet. Our company mission is we're in business to save the home planet. And we believe that protected public lands is a pillar of addressing the climate crisis. Folks have already said it, you've mentioned it. Something like a quarter of our carbon emissions in the US are derived from oil and gas extraction, fossil fuel extraction on public lands. We need to reverse that. We need to think of other policies and think of, reversing this concept of energy dominance. We can go other ways. There's great technology, great opportunity to do other things with energy. We don't need to take our public lands and use those for more fossil fuel extraction. And we're lucky to have an Attorney General who's pushing back on things like the fracking boom. So lots of reasons why. And again, I just lean in on supporting grassroots groups at the front lines who are working most on this.
Hey,
So
Sammy, can I jump into the jobs piece?
I wanted to follow up about that, so please go right ahead.
Yeah, and Hans, thank you for mentioning about this creates jobs, and this is actually a great way to come to economic recovery. A lot of folks have been talking about the backlog of maintenance needed on our public lands, regional parks, state parks, public federal lands, right? That this is actually a job creation program that we could do today in a new administration to get people back to work, to get folks of color in urban areas, young people who may not be exposed to some of these incredible lands. Let's get them into jobs a la the California Conservation Corps. Let's create a national conservation corps that will go in and do some of this work to create a whole new Green Corps that's about the backlog of maintenance, that's about stewardship of our federal and other public lands, and then expose them to new careers. They can become botanists, they can become scientists, they can do a lot of different things here. They can become landscape architects by just having exposure to this and have exposure to these incredible spaces. We could do this tomorrow. We have wonderful models here in California. Let's take it to scale. And these could be good paying jobs. These don't have to be low paying jobs. These could be jobs that lead to a career pathway in the Forest Service, in the National Park Service, in local public works agencies that are trying to create new green jobs around green infrastructure maintenance, right? This is what big picture thinking is about. And actually, our public lands can be part of that job generation solution. I know that the Build Back Better plan from the Biden administration touches on this a little bit, but this is really a great opportunity. I think this is something we want to talk a lot more about when we make the linkage between public lands and urban communities and the need to spread the wealth and exposure to other communities. So they can experience this and become stewards. Because you know, one thing you're right, Hans, once you go out into these spaces, you're never the same. You're never the same. You have this connection to the land and you have this sense of what's being threatened. And I'll make one more point, Sammy, and I'm going to stop, okay? Is the other piece is this is a great economic development tool for tribal communities as well. Tribes manage these lands for generations in a sustainable way. If we can pay attention to the lessons that they can teach us, like the Kuruks, you know, recently there was a Guardian article about this, about how that tribe had managed land and basically had been taken away from managing these federal lands. If we can enter into partnerships with tribes who have that knowledge, who can help co-lead and direct active management through prescribed burning that they know how to do and can help teach us to do, we can have better management and do something about these catastrophic conflagrations we're facing.
No, so I want to actually, I'll try to make this a segue here, and we'll see if it works. I mean, on the topic of, I mean, talking about protecting lands from wildfires and smart land management practices that can mitigate the, you know, awful fires we're seeing now. I mean, to go back to Graciela here, I mean, I know this has been, you know, one of these, you know, active debates as well in the Angeles National Forest, where you've had the Trump administration, you know, attempting to open parts of the forest and areas around Pine Mountain to what seems like heavy duty logging, you know, perhaps. I guess I'm hoping, you know, that sort of, again, is one of these issues where there's a lot of focus on oil and gas, a lot of focus on mining. I feel like logging has somewhat gotten less conversation or less coverage lately, but seems to be coming back into the news quite a bit with this wildfire conversation. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about, one, what's going on in Angeles National Forest on the federal land there, and sort of two, I guess, what sort of you see as the, you know, the right balance, if there is one on these lands, between, you know, what might be logging that's harmful versus, you know, forest management practices, thinning the, you know, the quote unquote raking of the forests, you know, that might be helpful from a fire perspective.
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say is that fire mitigation is an incredibly complex issue, and so we really have to be careful in the way that we talk about solutions and make sure that we're not applying a one-size-fits-all solution. And often, because I've been following some of the articles about media and the way, you know, talking about strategies. But the piece that's often left out is how that would apply in a certain ecosystem, right? So you can't apply the same strategy in a chaparral ecosystem that you would in like a conifer forest. So a lot of the times, or some of the fires that are happening up north are not going to, or the same fire strategy would not apply in Southern California, where you have coastal sage scrub or like an oak wood savanna. So we really have to be careful in the way that we talk about mitigation. And there's a lot of complexities around it. I would say that in the Los Padres National Forest, currently we have a project that was proposed by the Forest Service that would essentially log about 6 miles on a ridge called Pine Mountain. And so this is the size of approximately 575 football fields, American football fields, just to give you some context on the size of it. And the Forest Service has proposed to log trees that are up to 64 inches in diameter and masticate old growth chaparral. And this is one of the last remaining conifer forests in the region. And so one of the issues with this is that they are proposing it under a categorical exclusion, which means that they don't have to go through the normal environmental review process that is required by NEPA. And that's actually, I would say a categorical exclusion is part of NEPA, but technically, with a project of this size and scope, you would normally need to do an in-depth environmental assessment to really look at the impacts on the community, look at the impacts on the ecosystem. But in this situation, they're using a loophole called the categorical exclusion to push the project through and really fast track it. They're also calling it a forest health project or a thinning project for fire mitigation. But the issue that we have with that is that the project is actually in the backcountry, in the Ventura County backcountry, which is 15 miles away from the nearest community. And so what that means is that the science does not support that any sort of thinning of forest or fuel breaks are effective unless they are close to a community. Because oftentimes what happens with these catastrophic fires, as we're seeing in the Bay Area or as we saw here with the Thomas Fire in 2017, is that they happen under extreme weather conditions. And so usually under extreme winds, right? And so you have an extreme weather event like we had for the Thomas Fire, any of that doesn't really matter. Any sort of like fuel break projects or thinning projects become not as effective. And so you really have to look at the science and determine what makes the most sense for communities. Does it make sense to invest in this type of project, or does it make sense to invest in protecting the actual community by perhaps investing in protecting structures, in creating shelters for communities, or like retrofitting homes. So that's some of the issues that we're currently working on with Pine Mountain. It was in a public comment period that ended August 14th, generated over 16,000 comments in opposition for the project, which is huge for us. We're a very small organization, a team of 5. And so it really, the community, it speaks to the opposition of the community and how strongly people feel about this project. It's a very popular recreation area. It's incredibly diverse in its ecosystem, in wildlife as well. We're talking about mountain lions, bears, pretty diverse wildlife. And it's also a pretty significant cultural site for the Chumash community. And so the Chumash community, a couple of tribes have also come out in opposition and we're standing together as allies against this project.
So 2 things about that, Graciela. One, I appreciate your politely correcting me on which national forest we're talking about, because I think I referred to Angeles in my question, and I'm going to chalk that up to the fact that I was driving on I-5 last night, and I always enjoy seeing the signs in the grapevine, you are now exiting Angeles National Forest. I have that on the brain, perhaps.
Yeah, no problem.
I as well. I think the first point you made about just the complexity and how it varies so much by ecosystem. I was sort of joking about President Trump's comments in my question about California needs to rake its forests, but it is very much a shame that the nuances and the complexities of this conversation so easily get lost. So I appreciate your taking the answer in that direction and talking through that. I want to squeeze in one more question of my own here before we pick up audience questions, and I hope our hosts don't mind my doing that. Just one issue that we haven't talked about that's very near and dear to my heart, having lived and reported out in the desert for several years, is especially the question of renewable energy development on public lands. There's been, again, lots of focus on oil and gas drilling, but there's also this question of siting, especially solar farms and wind turbines on public land, which has been a source of controversy in California, because, even though these are projects that are meant to fight climate change, you do have ecological impacts. You do have impacts to, lands that can serve as carbon sinks potentially. Sean, I want to come back to you, since we started with you and then have kind of moved away from your expertise and some of the legal questions maybe. But, the Obama administration put out this land use plan, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which was basically this big roadmap for all the federal lands in the California desert. Where should you put renewable energy projects, and where should lands be totally protected from that? Trump administration said about 2.5 years ago they were going to review that and look at changes. So far, it's been kind of radio silent on that front. What should Californians be, either concerned or potentially hopeful about with this plan? What are you looking for in terms of, what might or might not change with this DRECP, and why should folks care about that?
Yeah, thank you. So this is obviously a super complex issue. We need to get more renewable energy online. Some of that renewable energy is going to have to be distributed in the sense that it'll be on commercial rooftops and residential rooftops, but we can't get to where we need to get in terms of addressing our energy supply and shifting away from fossil fuels without having some large utility scale of renewable energy. And so the question is, what do you do with that? And the desert has always been seen as the obvious place to put infrastructure because, for decades, people had this idea that there was really nothing out there. So we did our nuclear testing out there and everything else. And obviously that's not the case. And there are some really unparalleled natural and biological resources out in California's desert. And so it's really challenging. And I think many people who work on this from the environmentalist and conservation point of view struggle to figure out what are the right projects, what are not the right projects. Some of those projects affect Native American lands, some of them affect desert tortoise habitat. And the Obama administration, I think, really made a good faith effort to try to do real planning. The idea being, we'll try to figure out where we can site these facilities where they will do the most good and the least harm, knowing that there are going to be trade-offs. It's not perfect, but they made that attempt, overall, it's important that we actually do real planning of that kind so that we don't just decide, we're going to put this damaging facility here without thinking about it. The Trump administration has developed what they call an all of the above energy policy, but really it's a policy that favors fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, along with mining and other extraction, are heavily subsidized on federal lands in a lot of different ways. And so, I think, any pullback from a plan that truly allows, renewable energy where it needs to go is problematic. I don't know where this is going to go in what I imagine will be a Biden administration coming up. It's a very hard fought and difficult set of issues. But from what I've seen is that environmental interest groups are willing to come to the table, even those groups that are really interested in protecting particular lands, to figure out, in detail, where can we site this facility that it's not going to do as much harm? Where should we not put anything on public lands? And I'm optimistic that in a new administration, we'll start to move towards a rational planning approach again, which is the opposite of what we've seen in this administration.
Hans, one issue here that I've always been super curious about from the perspective and I have this perspective, as a hiker and an outdoor enthusiast myself. I know that, seeing oil and gas infrastructure when you're camping or out on the trail or doing whatever you do on public lands is probably not the most popular thing among Patagonia customers. Do you have any sense of how your customers or people who, utilize the outdoors tend to feel about seeing renewable energy infrastructure out there? If it's, if seeing a solar farm from the wilderness would be the same sort of visual or, blight on the land as seeing a field of oil and gas wells, or if it's different?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't seen any sort of, broad kind of polling of folks or sort of data-driven work along those lines, I have to admit. But I would say that, just from anecdotal kind of conversations with folks in our community and supporting a lot of groups that work on these issues, I think that it's all about, exactly as was just being discussed, the planning process, having it be smart and take into account what are the most sensitive areas. How can we make sure that those really sensitive areas in terms of cultural, biological, biodiversity values are treated with the utmost care? And then what are areas that frankly, might be more acceptable in terms of some development of energy projects? And I think our community is supportive of that really thoughtful process to make sure that we're paying attention to all the values and what the pros and cons are. I think that, what I think folks should focus their attention on in sort of an election season like this is, do we have elected leaders in place who will support a thoughtful process like that or not? We have an administration in place right now that's undermining the NEPA process, which is absolutely critical for evaluating any kind of development out there in our landscape in terms of the environmental trade-offs and costs. We need to elect folks into office who are champions for that thoughtful, science-based, and community-based approach, so that all the input comes in, we have the conversations from the start at the beginning, and we're not later sort of met with problems and concerns about whether it's aesthetic impacts or whether it's impacts on biodiversity or on community resources.
Thank you, Hans. That's as I said, I personally have a strong interest in that issue, so I'll be really interested to see where it goes, particularly if there's a Biden administration, to see what approach they follow. We've got a bunch of good questions from the audience here. I think I'm going to start with one that just opens it up to everyone, so whoever wants to take a crack at this. One of our listeners here asked, if the federal government continues to subsidize mining, logging, and fossil fuel extraction, what does that mean for the economic future of renewable energy? Which I think is a really interesting question. Curious if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Look, I'll start, and it looks like Sean wants to jump in too. Here's the reality. We're driving down the cost of renewable energy every single day. It just makes economic sense, even if you don't include the externalities of a petroleum economy, of what it's doing to our planet. So they've already lost that economic battle. It's just going to delay the inevitable. And the whole world knows that we need to trend towards renewable power. So it's really just throwing money down a rat hole that should be spent on the transition to a clean energy economy and making sure that that's an economy that supports people and creates good paying middle-class jobs. So it's wasted money. It's money down the toilet, but we're still going to transition to a clean energy economy. That is already on its way. Sean?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with all that. I mean, I think certainly the fossil fuel industry acknowledges that we are in a transition, and their goal is to make that transition last as long or take as long as possible. And I think Cecilia is absolutely right that to the extent that we are subsidizing fossil fuel, what we're doing is just delaying this inevitable transition, making it so that the Earth's conditions will be more challenging when we get to the transition, and maybe we'll pass a tipping point. And ultimately making that transition more expensive in a lot of different ways. I think the issue for mining is a little bit different, I suppose. That's not simply an energy question, but many people don't know that the mining law that was passed in the mid-1800s is still in effect, which essentially allows anyone to mine on federal lands without having to pay any sort of royalties or rent for the privilege of being able to take resources from public lands. And so that's a whole other set of questions about the needed overhaul of that law.
So, I mean, speaking of weird historical things that continue to affect us, another question that we've got here from the audience is just about sort of I'll paraphrase this a little bit. It seems to be a question about just the nature of the Bureau of Land Management and, this agency sort of historically existing to be an agency that disposed of public lands, and that is, something that sort of continues to pervade the culture of the agency. So, I mean, the question is really about, is there a conversation to be had, or are there ideas out there for ways that you could, either fundamentally change this agency or fundamentally change the way that federal lands are managed to move from, a paradigm of, this mixed use paradigm to perhaps a different paradigm in the future?
The creation of national monuments has been one means of doing that, which requires lands that formerly were managed for multiple use and for extractive uses to be managed for different types of uses. And the creation and maintenance of national monuments has been a huge step towards that. It's resulted in the creation of national parks by Congress out of those monuments. So Joshua Tree and many other national parks, including even the Grand Canyon, started out as national monuments claimed by a president and ultimately became part of the national park system. But you're right, and the commenters are right, that the mission of BLM is a multiple use mission that favors, in many cases, extractive industries. It doesn't have to be that way. There are other ways one could interpret even the current BLM regulations, and we've seen changes from administration to administration in the protectiveness. But I think it's also true that there's something very fundamental about the use of our public lands as managed by the Bureau of Land Management that it's not consistent with what most Americans actually believe our public lands are being used for one thing. But it does generally privilege extractive uses. But that can be, even within the current law, that can be changed from administration to administration, and some administrations have been more protective than others.
Does anyone else want to weigh in here?
I'll just jump in and say that, we're absolutely interested in that kind of transformation and what our government agencies have as their mission and what's driving their day-to-day decision-making about public lands. I think there's a huge opportunity with the BLM and with other agencies with, again, new leadership and leadership that has these priorities to think about how can climate, how can indigenous and native-led land and water management, how can more sort of focus on frontline communities and the impact, of protected lands. How can those values be more at the forefront and priorities within a structure like the BLM? And I think with new leadership, and this is why these issues are absolutely on this election right now. We need to think about who are the leaders who are going to bring that kind of vision into a new process going forward for everything that we believe in. And I'd say too, if folks want to have a little history on the fight around public lands and sort of the efforts to have our government pay more attention to these things and the things we care about, check out a new film that we've supported called Public Trust. It's on YouTube for free. Just search for it. Check it out. It's a great film that tracks some of the longer arc of this work to change and have our government pay more attention to these values.
So I think we have time for one more here, and I'll sort of combine two audience questions and try to build a little bit on the point Hans made about the new types of policies that might be needed. We have one question that asks, what intersectional solutions exist to center conservation on social justice? And a somewhat similar question asking about how climate change is blurring the lines between what's traditionally thought of as conservation and climate and environmental justice. So anyone who wants to weigh in here on just what specific types of policies we might have that can sort of address this intersectionality better.
I'll just say really quickly that fossil fuel extraction in particular is a place where we see more alignment between environmental justice interests and traditional conservation interests than just about anywhere else, because fossil fuel extraction both harms the communities that are closest to it and is not compatible with having a safe climate future. And so I've been really heartened by seeing the coalitions that have come out of opposing fossil fuel extraction.
Yeah, I would just say that at this point in time, we really have to think about these movements or stop thinking about these movements as separate and start thinking about them as one, whether it's conservation, environmental justice, or climate mitigation, because what we're seeing right now is that our public lands are actually a solution to climate mitigation. And so that's going to infect communities, across the board, whether you live in the Central Valley or you live in coastal California. And so we really need to ally ourselves better amongst groups to really be able to create solutions together. And so I think the question was in regards to environmental justice policy. I'm not necessarily sure like in California, but I would say that, a lot of times communities are looking to protect areas in areas that have traditionally been impacted by environmental injustices, and they don't have enough support. I know in California, here on the Central Coast, there's a project happening where they want to expand the Port of Oxnard, and it's going to impact the coastline. And so that is a conservation issue as well as an environmental justice issue. And I think there's a lot of things like that happening up and down California that at the local level that we don't always hear about.
I think that's a really good note to end on, and I will turn it back over to Cecilia, but not before very briefly again reminding everyone that if you would like to continue these conversations with me, I write a newsletter called Boiling Point, and latimes.com/boilingpoint is where you can sign up for that. So Cecilia, thank you for putting this conversation together.
Oh, thank you, Sammy. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much for digging in on these issues. We had an incredible turnout. Over 200 people watched this. I think we were at 250 at one point. Sammy, you did a great job in moderating. Thank you for your time. I also want to do a shout out to my team, Lise Mendez, Sarah Freeman, and Esma Mahdi, plus our incredible team, Joannie and others who helped us get the technology right. Everybody, this is an important election. This is really about the future of our democracy and the future about the lands that we love. So please get out and vote. And everybody, thank you so much. Stay tuned. We will get out a link to this to participants and watch the show that Hans was talking about. Maybe you could drop that in the chat box, Hans. But everybody, thanks so much. And let's save our democracy and our public lands. Thanks so much, everybody. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.